don't think it's hyperbolic to say at this point, but Goth, along with what's been, written for her, obviously, has delivered just one of the best final girls and slashers of the 2020s so far. And her performance in all three films is one of the best, I think, in any horror trilogy or horror series for that matter, across the decades, not just the 21st century, just across any horror film series. All right, my friends, let's go ahead and move on to my review, my long-awaited review for the third chapter in Ti West's X trilogy, Maxxine. So first of all, I want to apologize for the delay with this particular review. It's not that I didn't want to see Maxine or I wasn't excited for this particular movie. Quite the opposite, on both counts. As a matter of fact, I've been very, very busy lately with just so many things these past 2 weeks. Reviews and streams and, personal stuff in between, of course. Reviewing a ton of television as well, anime, other theatrical films as well. But I'm proud to say that I've finally seen Maxine, and I have a lot to say about it. But before jumping into the review itself, I do want to just kind of take a moment to honestly praise Ti West's previous two films in the X series, X and Pearl. Both films were some of my favorite movies from 2022, a year that was very good for horror in particular. These last few years in general were really good for horror. But, with 2022, of course, not only getting films like Pearl and like X, we also got other films like Smile and Barbarian came out that particular year. Again, just cementing these last few great years of horror. But the X films, these films weren't initially on my radar. And they were just such a fantastic surprise when they came out. And in my opinion, continued A24's winning streak when it came to a lot of genre projects, a lot of horror projects in particular. X was a wonderful homage to the 1970s backwoods slashers of the period, inspired by films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Deliverance, one of my favorite movies. It not only captured the aesthetic of those films, but it was complemented by a well-written cast of characters, great performances across the board, numerous creepy and gory moments, and a great dual performance by Mia Goth as the characters of Maxine and Pearl. And speaking of Pearl, the prequel sequel that followed just a few months, later was just as good, if not better, than X, with Mia Goth returning to play, a much younger Pearl living in rural Texas during World War I, towards the end of World War I. And it explored, her life, her family, and numerous acts of bloody violence. It was shot beautifully and paid homage to the Technicolor films of the 30s all the way up to the 60s. Drawing inspiration from movies like The Wizard of Oz and Disney films like Mary Poppins. It had a very unique look. It's one of the most, honestly, unique horror films, I would say, this century so far. There's kind of nothing else like it in terms of its presentation, which makes it stand out in my mind. But both were great, and they both complement each other so well. So, despite being just so different from each other, and because of that and the quality of those two movies, it just kind of increased my excitement for Maxine. However, since I took so long to see the film, I did hear some mixed things about Maxine. Not that it was bad, just that it maybe didn't reach the same heights of quality of the first two films. So I kind of adjusted my expectations before seeing them, though I was still very much looking forward to them, especially after recently just rewatching the previous two films for our Discord watch parties, which were so much fun. But in any case, I finally watched it. So what do I think of it? Well, I'm very happy to say that I really enjoyed this movie. And it has a lot of great things going for it on a technical and performance level. And Mia Goth's role as Maxine, along with Pearl, is honestly just one of the best all-time great performances in a horror series. Now, the film itself takes place several years, I think like 6 or so years after the events of X. And Maxine is trying to achieve her dream of being a film star while living in Los Angeles and working in the adult film industry. You know, at the time, LA is being plagued by the Night Stalker, an infamous serial killer that has the citizens of the city just gripped in paranoia and tension. And much like X and Pearl before it, Maxine's aesthetic is wonderfully realized by Ty West and his collaborators. They do an excellent job recreating the 80s grime and sleaze of LA. You know, they're definitely paying homage to 80s slashers, but also noir films and Italian horror movies like Giallo films, you know, that were kind of coming out during the same time. You also have the backdrop not only of the Night Stalker killings, which happened, but also the satanic panic that gripped the 80s as well. You know, we see people protesting, angrily shouting in zealous just fervor over what they perceive is you know, dreck being made by Hollywood, the Hollywood system and the film industry. It's just a great place. It's just a great place and setting for not only just a horror film, but just an examination of American culture during this time period, too. It's got a lot going for it in that regard. The film cinematography and score is great across the board. Cinematographer Elliot Rocket and composer Tyler Bates both return from the previous 2 films, and they absolutely knock it out of the park. They both do a great job of making you feel like you're just immersed in the style, the glitz, the glam, and the grime of the 1980s, the 80s of Los Angeles. Now, if you also happen to be, I think, a big fan of Italian horror films, giallo movies, you know, films made by like Brian De Palma or Dario Argento, then I think you're going to get a pretty big kick out of this particular film and the aesthetic that it's masterfully recreating. You know, if you're unfamiliar with the style and sensibilities of those types of films and those filmmakers, you know, I can kind of see Maxine as being a bit of sort of a gateway film, an introduction to those types of movies. Now, in terms of performances, Mia Goth is a star in the movie. She's right. And then, remember when she screams that in Pearl, I'm a star? She is. Mia Goth is absolutely a star in this movie, much like she was in the previous 2 films as both Pearl and Maxine. Maxine here is more hardened, badass, and driven. You know, it's obvious her previous experiences in X has shaped her into the woman she's now become. And she's not letting anything get in the way of her life that she's determined to achieve and maintain. You know, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say at this point, but Goth, along with what's been, you know, written for her, obviously, has delivered just one of the best final girls and slashers of the 2020s so far. And her performance in all 3 films is one of the best, I think, in any horror trilogy or horror series for that matter, across the decades, not just the 21st century, just across like any like horror film series. You also have a pretty a number of good supporting performances in the movie as well. Giancarlo Esposito, in particular, who plays the character of Teddy Knight. He's like this agent of adult film stars and D-list or Z-list actors. He's very good in the movie. And it's also just nice to see him not playing just another version of Breaking Bad's Gus. You know, even though he's great. Even though he's great at playing Space Gus in Star Wars, Corporate Gus in The Boys, Vampire Gus in Abigail. You know, here he's playing a different type of character. And it really worked for me. It shows us like he can do other types of characters other than Gus, than variations of Gus, and he proves it in this movie. He's a very capable actor, and they do write some fun stuff for him in the film. Now, I do think, this is kind of sad to say, I do think this is probably the weakest entry in the trilogy. For a number of reasons, couple reasons. First of all, this film has the most supporting characters than any of the other previous movies. And a number of them just kind of feel underwritten or just really goofy. I think to a degree that might have been intentional, to replicate kind of the goofiness of 80s slasher films or giallo movies, where the characters, a lot of characters that are just meant to be meat for the grinder, if you will. And that's a bit disappointing just because the characters in the previous X films, both Pearl and X, had so much to them. They had so much meat on their bones, if you will, and were developed, and you actually cared. Kevin Bacon, for instance, who is a great actor, is an example of one of those underwritten characters, in my opinion. He plays this private dick, this private detective, and everything just from his look, his accent, his mannerisms, just kind of came across as silly to me. Too over the top. He feels like a cartoon character in this movie, a Looney Tune. You might as well just put Foghorn Leghorn in a suit and be like, here you go. Here's the private detective character, or Bugs Bunny or Daffy Duck, and it would have worked out. And it's disappointing because the previous film, as I said, the previous films and their supporting characters were actually just very well written, and they had depth. And so when bad stuff inevitably happened to them in those movies, I actually cared and felt bad for them. Here you're like, well, you're a goof and you fucked around and now you found out. That extends to some of the other characters in the film. There's like this other detective duo, Bobby Cannavale and Michelle Monaghan. They play two characters that they just don't feel like real people either. And again, it might be intentional, but it didn't always work for me. The film's third act is probably the most divisive thing about the movie. They establish just a mystery of who the killer is, Night Stalker and all that, and you'll probably figure it out before you get to the third act. It starts to become very obvious who it actually is. The finale, like other giallo films before it, is bigger and more outlandish than the final acts of the previous two films in the X series, which, despite the material they were working with, still managed to keep them very grounded and realistic. In this movie, it's much bigger. Again, I do still feel like it's intentional, but the execution of it did leave me wanting to a degree. Or I wish maybe they thought of something a little different. But despite those complaints, this is a good horror film. I really enjoyed this movie despite some of the issues that I had. It's a horror film that's oozing with 80s film grime and blood and gore and goop, a lot of goop, with great cinematography. Lighting, the lighting in this is impeccable. The lighting and the shadow work has always been great in any of the previous films, but especially here. You have a great score. And again, another excellent performance from Mia Goth, who, in my mind, and I'm sure in other people's minds as well, cements herself as one of the best final girls with the character of Maxine, and just one of the best slashers with Pearl in the 2020s so far, and probably this century, and just kind of overall when you think about it, across the board, both in X and Pearl, and finally with Maxine, there is this nice level of consistency. Perhaps Maxine is the weakest film, but it succeeds more than it does. It has so much going for it. And Ty West has talked about doing another entry in this series. And honestly, he can kind of take in any direction that he wants. And that's what's super exciting about this. It's like, It could end with this film. It could. Or you can continue on into the 90s with Maxine. Or you can go back and explore. And this was actually suggested by a number of you guys. Deadpool and Kaz Faye and a few others had talked about maybe doing a film in between the events of between the events of Pearl and X, following Pearl and Howard. Maybe it's like a Bonnie and Clyde type movie where they're going around and murdering people, and then they do that before they get too old. And obviously, and we see that in the events of X. Or they can do anything else they want. You can follow Howard if they choose to. Well, what was Pearl doing during World War II when Howard went to war again? Like, there's a lot they could do with this franchise, and examine and critique and pay homage to, like all the other 3 films have. And so, yeah, if they want to continue this on, I'm all for it. I'm ready for it, because I think this is, and again, I don't think this is hyperbolic to say, I do think this is probably one of the best horror trilogies out there. It's certainly in the conversation. It's certainly in the top 10 at the very least. But yeah, I ended up really enjoying Maxine, and I recommend it. But what about you guys? I'm actually very curious to hear from you, because very divisive film, apparently. There was some people that really dug it, some people that thought it was good, but maybe not as great as the previous 2, and a few people from what I've heard that just were disappointed by it. But very curious to hear your thoughts.
5 minutes later.
Let me see what you guys are saying. Let me scroll up here. Katria Hands. By the way, I want to go ahead and thank Katria for gifting me this amazing shirt. Look at this, chat. From Motel Hell. It's from Motel Hell. All sorts of critters and Farmer Vincent's fritters. Good shit. We got to rewatch Motel Hell one day. Good to have you. Get your hard hands, happy tappy Dono dance. You were just in time for my review. Because hopefully this will get people to do what I did last September when I was sick as a dog and watch a bunch of Argento movies on Tubi. I think this is, as I said in my review, I think this is a great introduction, gateway to those types of movies. Because if you look at those and just the structure and how, like, even in a lot of, like, Argento's movies, like, the third act is fucking bonkers. It really is. When you look at it, it gets, like, super crazy. Maybe there's, like, a long build-up, maybe a little slow. But by the time you get to the third act, the last half hour or so, it's like, wait, what are we doing? Like, you lose your mind. I feel like that's what Ty West was trying to do. Whether he succeeded. Obviously, it's in the opinion of the viewer, of course. But for me, I think it was a little mixed. Let's see here. Different character, guys. Yeah, today he was someone different. He was something a little different, which is nice. I love Giancarlo Esposito in this. He did a great job. He did a very good job. I enjoyed some pretty good and obscure giallos through my life. Mario Bava's Blood and Black Lace, one of my favorite horror films. I've never seen that one. Not a Dario Argento fan, Bat Boy, though I think I've said this before. While I do like Suspiria, I don't like a lot of his movies, and I still say he was the worst version of Phantom of the Opera. Oh, man. I've never seen this version. Katria, I mean, if you know history, you know who the Night Stalker is, unless they change it up in the movie. Yeah, I don't want to, All I'll say is, I won't say anything. That's why I'm being very cautious when talking about the Night Stalker. But the thing is, you will figure out who the Night Stalker is in this world. Again, this is kind of like a historical, like, fictionalized world, but yeah. Chris Ayers, yeah, it's one of those third movies that's bad to where it damages what came before. Yeah, excuse me. It's not one of those third movies that's bad to where it damages what came before and makes it tough to recommend the whole trilogy. It's just the one that has the most flaws. Agreed. But there's enough stuff that does work well. It's still works. Agreed. I agree. Yeah. We're pretty much on the same page, I think, Mr. Ayers. I enjoyed this movie. I think the last third of the movie was the weakest part. Yeah. I think across the board everyone's saying that. So I agree. But it wasn't bad by any means. Yes, I think I'd rank this in the middle. Pearl's still probably number 1 for me. Yeah, Pearl's my personal favorite. Just rewatching those films so recently, just because Pearl is just so different than, like, a lot of horror films out there, and just the aesthetic, the time period, the Technicolor look. It's like, this is just really interesting. And so Pearl's probably my favorite. Right now, how I'm feeling, which again could change, but I feel pretty confident in this. Pearl, like, my ranking for the X trilogy, as it is, because they probably will make more movies eventually. It goes Pearl, X, and then Maxine. Let's see. Chris just wants more tips on how to start his own human guard. I kind of do a little bit. It was a good process. It worked out. They got it down to a system. They had it down to a system and a routine. It was nice. It's like the horror equivalent of when Tarantino does a movie set in the past. Yes. Great way to describe Mr. Ayers. 4K. I was not really a fan of Maxine. I thought it was okay. I was not really feeling the characters. I can understand that. I would give it a 6 out of 10, though. I don't want to say much of Richard Ramirez because I'm afraid it will be a spoiler, but I wasn't a fan of the whole Richard Ramirez thing in the movie. Yeah. It's, again, getting into details about the Night Stalker, the killer angle, it's ripe for spoilers. That's all I'll say. But I understand your complaints. Isaac, I arrived to the party late, but God knows this is at least up there with Pearl. I don't think it is. I don't think it is, Isaac. I still think it's good. I think it's very good, but it does not reach the same heights. I think it has just a few too many issues to make it as good as Pearl or X, in my opinion. But I still really liked it, though. Yeah. Ace of Cardinal Power. I hope you get power back soon, good sir. Stay cool in the meantime. But yeah, I'm still really glad I saw it, chat. You know, I had to think about it. You know, will this be on my top 10? I don't know. But I still think it's a very good movie right now. I really enjoyed it. If not in my top 10, it'll definitely be a part of my honorable mentions later this year. But yeah, I recommend it. Check it out. If you already like the first two movies, then I think you should probably check this out. Now, I'm excited, though, if they ever potentially do another film, which he said he is. I'm very curious to see what direction he'll go in. I kind of wonder, though, maybe, like, since this one is so focused on Maxine, if he will eventually go back to Pearl. So I would not be shocked if they actually do, like, an in-between, like a prequel sequel set in between the events of Pearl and X. I think that would be pretty awesome. I kind of want to see that. I'd like to see that, but we'll eventually see. I'll review it. I'll watch it. We'll talk about it. Do watch parties for it. And eventually, when this is available on a various service, PutinTube, for instance, we'll definitely do a watch party for it as well. So we have that to look forward to. So is it worth going to the theaters or better to catch it on V? I didn't mind, you know, paying money to check out this film, going to see this last night. It was still super fun. It has a lot going for it despite its flaws. I really enjoyed it. So yeah, I recommend it.